If you don't know about compression, you're missing out because it's a foundational tool that you can use to enhance all your recordings. Compression solves a couple of problems. One, you may find your audio volume just seems too low compared to everyone else's recordings. Or your recording lacks energy and you want the tone to have a little something extra. What do I mean by extra? Well, people use various words like attack and edge and punch. These are a little bit vague, so let me see if an example will show what extra compression brings. You will need headphones to hear what I'm talking about, so I hope you put some on. And also, our context here is specifically spoken word recordings, including for videos, but we're not talking about compression as it relates to music. All right, here is a voiceover. This is Renee completely uncompressed.
Type your name exactly as it appears on the course catalog page so that the course appears under your name.
Now here's the exact same clip of Renee with compression applied.
Type your name exactly as it appears on the course catalog page so that the course appears under your name.
Hear the difference? Let's play it one more time. I'm going to use this bypass button to turn off compression. Then I'll turn compression back on right in the middle of the phrase so we'll get a really clear before and after.
Type your name exactly as it appears on the course catalog page so that the course appears under your name.
So that's an example of what compression adds. If you want that little something extra in your voiceover, I'm going to explain how you get it right now. There's two parts to this. First, we'll explain just the concept of compression and what's going on technically, and then I'll explain how to adjust all the settings so that you get good compression. So first the what, then the how-to. Here we go. Compression takes advantage of how humans perceive volume. Here's a sound wave. If I ask you, how loud is it? You might look at the decibel meter on the right and go, oh, it's about -3 decibels. And that's how we often think of sound. We think of the peaks. But here's the issue with peaks. Let me look around for a high peak in the file. Okay, this one will do. Okay, let me play it for you. Did you hear it? One more time. What's the issue here? Peaks are brief. They're transitory. They're fractions of a second. So it turns out that as humans, we don't perceive volume based primarily on peaks. We perceive volume based primarily on average loudness. Now, how do we get average loudness? To understand average loudness, we need the concept of dynamic range. Dynamic range just means what's the difference between the loudest and quietest extremes in my file. Now, I've taught this, and sometimes people get confused and think that dynamic range is volume. It's not volume, it's contrast in volume. So, for example, if you take classical music and the Ramones, which one has the biggest dynamic range? Well, it's actually classical music because we're talking about contrasts. You might have a passage with one little piccolo playing, and then in comes the whole orchestra with brass and woodwinds and 14 violins and a timpani player having a tantrum. That's why dynamic range. Now, the Ramones might play louder, but what's the quiet passage in I Want to Be Sedated? There isn't one. So there is very limited dynamic range because the whole thing almost is at the same volume. So we're looking at a sound wave now. Recall that it's actually a visualization of something that's vibrating and pushing air that makes a sound. So let's say the speaker is vibrating. When it pushes air, that's shown as this peak. When it pulls back in so it can vibrate again, that's negative air pressure. That's the trough down here. Dynamic range is the distance in decibels from peak to trough. We asked at the start of this, what is compression compressing? The answer is dynamic range. Compressors turn the peaks down and they pull the troughs up, in effect making the sound more dense, and you hear it differently. Now, this is what makes compression tricky to understand. As you heard, when I applied it, it seemed to make the file louder, but on a technical level, what it's actually doing is turning the extremes down. So technically, our sound went from this high to this high. But what most compression tools then is, now that it's made this narrower dynamic range, it takes that whole narrower range and lifts it back up to the original peaks. This effect is called makeup gain because it makes up for the volume lost when we turn down the peaks. So even though technically that makeup gain is not part of compression, it's always bound into most compressors. So you get this little volume boost, which you can specify. So to recap this section, we hear volume more by average loudness than by peak loudness. So compression reduces dynamic range to make a denser average, then adds makeup gain to return the whole to its original peaks. And when this is done right, it adds both volume and attack for a more polished, pleasing sound. So now you know what compression is doing. So obviously you go, oh, I want some of that. How do I do it? How do I use it? That's our next part.